All right. Well, we're continuing talking about uh, parenting in our series, The Mission of God from the Family. And the subsection is parenting like the Father, or parenting like God the Father. And we've been talking about some of the more practical aspects of teaching and training, enforcing, disciplining, and forgiving, and then repeat. That's just the process of training and disciplining kids. And I want to put some of this now into that broader context of what we've been talking about with what does this have to do with being on the mission that God has given to a family? Um, we've been talking about the way a that God has given the task of dominion to the family, to Adam and Eve, and to each of our families, and that we've got the three spheres of the home and the land and the wilderness, or the garden, the land, and the wilderness, and how the garden and the home is the place where people are made and they're formed and they get their ideas, their identity and their ideas of what the world ought to be like. The land is the place where we're going out and gathering resources and bringing them back to the home in order to transform the home and in order to build it. And then the wilderness is that place where there's where the wilds need to be tamed, and where the dragons are that need to be fought, where the difficulties of un uh, un ungathered resources, or untamed resources, need to be first. The imagination of our children should be such that they say, I can do something out there, go out, start a family, take a piece of the wilderness, turn it into garden. And when I run, and they should expect that they're going to run into difficulties and people, opposition, both just with the way the world works, as well as competition, um and that that in their mind, the story that they're in is one that they can, that they're giving their life away, such that the world as a whole, the world is in a better place than it was when they before they got involved. And um there's a really uh, great passage that I like. So um, well, Genesis 3:15, Eve is told that her seed is going to go out um, and stomp on the head of a dragon, right? That the heel of her seed will crush the head of the serpent. And then um, in in 1 Timothy 2:15, I believe, you have Paul saying that the faith that Eve had about what God was going to do is something that we should take in. Now, there's a primary way in which we look at Jesus as the seed of Eve, and then there is a pattern where Eve's faithfulness, Eve's looking forward to what her children and was going or what her ultimate son was going to do, and then rejoicing, is something that we should be raising our kids in as well, right? So that, not in the same sort of way, because we don't trust our children to go out and die for our sins or something like that, but because the hope that Eve has, the motherly hope that Eve has about what her child is going to accomplish, um, is taken as a pattern of faith, right, or a pattern of faithfulness, right. So all of us can look at the way Eve hoped for her. Hoped forward for what her children are going to do. And there's a natural hope that we look forward to what our children are going to do, that also becomes a picture of the ultimate hope that Eve has for Christ as well, that's attached to that particular promise, right? We want our kids to go out and accomplish something. We hope that they will. That's a good thing. Well, um, there the uh but one of the ways that our children become more like Christ, one of the means by which our children become more like Christ is the teaching, training, correction, forgiving process that we've been talking about. And there's a way in which that process can have a heel hardening effect on our children. That it makes our children um, grow into the kinds of people that expect to step on the heads of serpents, right? That it has a heel hardening um, purpose to it, and that is. But I want to look at Galatians 6 to show you what I mean, right? To show you what it means, because he says, "Brethren, if any man is overtaken in a trespass or in a fault, you who are spiritual, restore one in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also are tempted." Right. And that is a really good verse for parents, because parents do a lot of correcting of children as they're overtaken in a fault. And so he says that we're supposed to be depending upon the spirit, right? We're supposed to be walking in the spirit. And this is one of the metaphors that Paul uses a lot to describe what it looks like to follow the Lord, right? To be walking in the spirit, right? So be you who are spiritual, uh, restore one in the spirit of meekness or gentleness, right? So uh, you don't, as a parent, want to be harsh and destructively attacking your child when they're overtaken in a fault, but drawing them back with meekness and kindness and in a spirit of gentleness. And it says, "Consider yourself, lest you also be tempted." And sometimes you hear this verse saying, make sure that you're not going to fall into the sin that you're trying to bring them back from. And that might be the case, but I actually think um, it makes more sense in the context to think, consider yourself lest you also be tempted, that in the correction that you fall into a spirit of harshness, right? So he says, if you see someone overtaken in a fault, and you are doing well, walking in the spirit, and you go to restore someone, make sure that you're not going to fall into pride, that you're not going to fall into a harsh attitude, or a prideful, harsh attitude. What's wrong with you, right? And I know that was always a temptation, especially when you're raising boys, where you go, "Are you brain damaged? I don't understand. What's wrong with you?" Right? And you take on a pridefulness rather than compassion, which we're supposed to have, which says, how was I like you at your age, or in what ways do I fall into the same sorts of sins, analogically? How's there an analogy between me and you, so that I can understand as I come towards you to help you out of the difficulty? Um, well, so he says that process of correction, then he follows immediately on with "bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ." Right now, the "bear one another's burdens" is a big part of what happens in business, in economics, right? In the way that we interact with one another, right? We go out as servants, and there's a sense in which whatever it is that we go out into the go out as transformers of the world, as people that are taking dominion. We go out there in order to look for ways to bear one another's burdens, right? When we do that well, sometimes it's very lucrative, sometimes it's not, right? But that's not the primary purpose of of going out and transforming the world. The primary purpose is to serve our neighbor, right? And the way that we express value added to one another's lives is through the exchange of money, but the goal is to add value to one another's lives, right? To bear one another's burdens. And he says, so fulfill the law of Christ, right? When we're imitating Jesus, right? So this correction leads to an imitation of Jesus that opens our eyes to our neighbor's needs. Um, and then he says, "And if a man thinks himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. But let every man prove his own work, and then shall he have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For every man shall bear his own burden. Right. So he's got he's talking about this community that grows up surrounding work and the work that we do, the kind of daily, day in, day out work and labor that we do that serves one another. That we want to bear our own burdens, but we often need help. But we see our neighbors with burdens, and we want to help bear their burdens. Right? That the law of Christ ends up knitting us together into working communities. And but it begins with this correction that happens that that uh, that happens a lot as a parent. Now he's not talking primarily about parenting. I'm just showing that this the kind of society where somebody that corrects who is spiritual leads to this kind of society where the labor is fruitful, but it's also a labor that serves one another, right? That and that it leads to uh, folks that work hard to bless one another and to bear one another's burdens, right? And those kinds of communities are often very successful economically. And there's a reason uh, there's a connection there um, that that Paul is making that I think analogously applies to the way that we correct our children, right? So that we should be thinking um, in terms of as we correct our children that we're correcting them so that they can see how other people can be blessed by their work, that they can see other people's burdens, right? That the correction opens their eyes to other people's burdens and how they can become the kind of people that see a burden and throw their shoulder underneath it, right? That and a lot of this is we want to become those kinds of people ourselves and lead our children into being those kinds of people. And then there's a real transformative effect, right? Those kinds of people leave a wake behind them, right? They affect the world. They leave a divot everywhere they go of God's goodness, of God's grace, of kindness. The uh, I had a really just odd experience recently, just going to pick up a pizza, and I walked in and I said, "How's your day going?" to the person behind the counter, and 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 or I wasn't doing anything spectacular, but what they said was, I think you're the first person to smile at me since I started my shift. I was like, oh, that's a weird um, that's unfortunate, right? That's sad. Um, but we want to be the kind of people that see somebody and we don't see a means to an end, but we see a person, right? We see and in any way that we can, we don't want to be burdens. We want to lift burdens. Well, Paul here connects that to a well-functioning discipline process by the spiritual who love to, with meekness, kindness, and gentleness, help those who have been overtaken in a fault back to the right track. If that's not a good description of the process of parenting, then I don't know what is, right? Your kids are constantly falling into ditches on either side of the road, falling into faults. And as parents, we want to be spiritual. We want to be walking in the spirit so that we can guide them, we can correct them into the kind of people that whose eyes are opened to the burdens of people around them, and they want to uh, fulfill the law of Christ and bear one another's burdens, and that will help them to become the kind of people that can do well out in the wilderness of business, because that servant-hearted attitude Paul connects to the effectiveness of our work. I hope that is encouraging and shows how discipline is a part of the mission that God has given to families, and not just something that we do because we're annoyed, but because we have a launch prerogative that we are working on with our kids as we raise them.